Alright, it's done. Or at least, the read-through for the Escapades of Fay Willows is done. Now, I figured to basically cap off of basically finishing off the read-through for the story. I basically would go over some thoughts basically how am I continuing to a book 6 if basically one is basically written. I don't plan to actually write one, but I mean, it's basically good to get these ideas basically out to basically just think about what I might want to do with them later. So I'll note that basically right after it's basically done with book 5, there was basically some thoughts basically in my mind about what I basically would do to continue the story. I'll note that basically I touched on a little bit of the lore and the fact that we had the middle planes basically no longer existing and stuff like that, or the lands being thrown up into the middle of Maj'Eyal. But I'll note basically for the deserts of Maj'Eyal, I thought it might be an idea to sort of explore what basically happened to Nuloran. We know that basically their continent basically sank and they basically turned into the Nagas. But I'll note that from the perspective the deserts of Maj'Eyal, they may not have actually known what's basically going on. And even though they say they send emissaries and stuff like that, there's no real contact from the rest of Maj'Eyal's citizens that something was basically going on in the east part of Maj'Eyal. So it might be something basically to look into, for example. Another thing to basically touch on as well would be the orcs. And basically the touch and go, we did actually have to mention the orcs in book 1, for example, because obviously they basically were terrorizing the the continent. The spell basically happened to basically stop them specifically, and then the cataclysm basically happened after for most part. But I figured that's basically something else I could actually touch on as well. We could basically have the orcs being mentioned as a rising threat once again. And something I basically thought would be interesting basis to sort of jump into. I'll note this sort of bloodlust of the dozens of Maj'Eyal. They really don't treat orcs as being anything more than something we killed. And besides the fact that the orcs be resurgent, we can also have some mention of the orc youths and what basically we do with them. Do the Maj'Eyals just let them basically live as slaves and stuff like that, or is it just sort of Goblin Slayer where just kill off the orc young, just they would an adult? Because they're all evil, they must all die. So that's basically something else I may touched on as an idea basically for going forward. There's also the idea of these dwarven samurais that basically is worth mentioning as well. So I'll note that basically was writing up the book specs of these books. Dark God basically sort of noted that maybe it's ideas a secondary race we could have these dwarven samurais, which basically just aftermath basically sampling into the western part of Maj'Eyal. And basically the samurais would be this new race that basically you could play. And I thought to myself that that didn't really work for me, but I mean it might work as something to basically explore. I see them as being sort of the YC in a way, but unlike the YC, they're basically a little bit more shall we say the world doesn't actually just hate them. It's just that these guys are unlucky. So they're not basically being actually just killed or anything like that. They're just really just being just unlucky for circumstances and what basically happened to them. That'd be how I basically portray them. Another thing I basically wanted to possibly touch on as well. So I'll note that basically in the game and how my story basically is written, we don't really see a whole lot of interaction the floor with the outside world. And I thought it might be an idea to actually have it where maybe after the spell plays, after the cataclysm happened, some of the more adventurous floor might actually decide at this point it's time to basically leave their home force to actually look around and see what's become the world. And the idea here is basically they like this exclusion of their force, but they're not basically in a vacuum anymore, as they basically realize. So they're being a little more active and basically trying to figure out what's basically going on out there. And Fay basically run into one of these Belfaloran, and then from there, we basically learned that now the Floran basically trying to venture out a little bit more because of what basically happened. And how's Fay basically gonna interact with her fellow Floran who are still first ruins and stuff like that, and she's not. So what's gonna happen here? Are they gonna treat her like a criminal? What's gonna happen? Now I'll note that these ideas here are sort of I'll say they're sort of the C tier ideas to sort of speak of. I'll note basically the ideas these ideas I I was never really like too like invest into like maybe like following up with something like relating to him. But I mean, those are like ideas that like could be explored a little bit, I guess, if like I just need something to make it right and like go with. But they're like not particularly interesting to me. Getting to some of these ideas down here though, it's a little bit different. And no, that's fine. We want Fair and ToME. Alright, so going on out with like these ones right down here. Yeah, well, let's go like right here. So I'll note with like Mage Terran, he's basically the mage who like basically is like the like apprentice mage, like mage basically outside like the world map, who basically like invites people into Angolan if they basically get like an artifact for him. And I thought that like it might be an idea to sort of like expound a little bit on his character, because we don't really know much about like Mage Terran. He's basically just like a just a random figure basically staying around like the world map, who eventually if like you got enough cunning basically figure out it's like this archmage that's basically like in here. But the idea is like we could have basically like a little bit more interaction, like showing off what he's basically all about, his character, and basically sort of like expound like who he basically is and stuff like that. Now something else to know as well is that like there's also basically like the rogue mages and like necromancers like that are basically like running around like the spell hunt. It might be an idea to sort of like touch on them a little bit as well at this point. We already have like the necromancer though, but we could have like a little more stories about like the rogue mages and like their shenanigans, basically like kind of like Urgus like of the Tempest and stuff like that. But we could have like maybe like guys causing earthquakes or like floods and stuff like that, whatever. And from there we could basically have like the Krogs basically being introduced to sort of stop them, because we don't have a lot of lore for them right now at this point, because nothing's really written for them. But the Krogs versus spellcasters could be a thing where like we could see basically how like they deal with like spellcasters, or like against necromancers, for example, where necromancers basically will have no chance basically like resurrecting him because of how their basically body constitution works. Alright, so I basically consider like these basically like sort of like C tier ideas, these be like B tier. But getting down to these ones down here. So I found in my mind that like if I was basically sort of like write like a sort of like book 6, these would be like the ideas I really want to basically sort of touch on a little bit more. So one of the ideas that like the least of these like feature ideas is basically get the idea of like Krog self-determination. And what I basically mean by Krog self-determination, I'll note that basically in the game, Krogs basically aren't necessarily like Ziggurat basically by default. They actually have to go through the test, just like all the other adventurers like going through the game. But it might be an idea for like the Krog that like basically as a story point, we can actually like see where like yes, they are programmed, but at the same time they're still individuals with like their own thoughts and like ideas. And it might be that like initially maybe Ziggurat basically were like including them in their army, just like like any other like initiative basically. But after a point they basically realize, oh, these Krogs may not necessarily be like fully for a cause. And even though like they're still like particularly like disdainful for spellcasting and stuff like that, they might still have like some degree of like morality basically to them, which is like different from like the Ziggurat. So yeah, basically like determine like how the Krog behave different from like the Ziggurat. So self-determination as opposed to being Ziggurat foot shoulders. Now, another idea basically I want to basically sort of like expound on is the fact that we have like that female ogre who we basically left behind in the battlefield on book 3. So you'll note that basically like in like book 3 we basically have like that little like mention of like how there's basically this female ogre, she drops her weapon, she falls to the ground, she's basically done. But we can basically have like a story basically where we basically see this like this like now Krog basically running around on the battlefield, and she basically like remembers Fay. And I would be like an idea like we're tying into like self-determination where even though she's probably going to be like brainwashed by Ziggurat, they basically like they may have like turn her into a Krog, but she still basically like remembers like Fay basically helping her out, regardless of the fact that basically like she now has like she's basically anti-magic, but she doesn't necessarily like hate Fay's the idea, right? So we can actually have like a story where like we see like this like female like Krog, maybe like she witnesses like Fay in action, like she basically initially wants to kill her, but she realizes like no, this is a person who wants to help around, so I want to leave her alive. So maybe she might like stop her fellow Krog from killing her, stuff like that. This idea is sort of like jump into if I basically continue these books with like Fay. So here's an idea that basically like I really like but really like think that should be like advanced on at some point. And I'm not basically in the game because of how I basically wrote like infusions. They're basically sort of like herbs and like medicines that you basically sort of apply to your skin, like any or like ointment and stuff like that. And I think like with like the Krog being introduced, we could have like this idea where like because like they're advanced with the Krog, we basically have like the idea where like the Ziggurat basically maybe figure out how to make like these advanced infusions that you basically see in the game where like you basically inscribe them on you, sort of like runes, but as opposed to runes basically go under your skin and like they like give you like these like tangible buffs similar to like runes, but without like the magical like inputs that result. And that'd be like a way of basically sort of like tying in like what basically like the Ziggurat basically sort of like gave to the world besides the Krog, for example. And it's basically here sort of like found the idea like the Ziggurat basically aren't evil. They're basically just like zealots for like their own cause. I suppose like the best way of like sort of like denoting would be something like say Black Lives Matter or like Antifa, for example, where like they are definitely like bad guys, we'll say, for the least, but at the same point like they do like have like their good elements to them. They have to basically like keep in mind. All right, so I'll note that like the last thing to sort of mention here is like Trapped in a Forbidden Tome by Wayne. So I'll note that basically like if I was basically continue this, the number one idea basically had for like continuing the story would not actually be as a story, but rather as like an in-game element that you actually play as. And the idea would be like just be like a Forbidden Tome you can basically go explore, like may or other ones are basically in the game. And essentially the idea is like Owain, her husband, basically trapped her in the Forbidden Tome to basically keep her alive because Fay's basically mortal. She does die. Owain does not because he's basically like a Shaloran who's basically been like advanced and stuff like that. And the idea is basically like until like basically figure out a way of like Owain basically figures out a way of basically make it so like Fay can be immortal. He basically traps her in the Forbidden Tome so that like she can't die. And that's basically like loving and like very twisted the same way. And I think it would basically work as like a sort of like idea element basically sort of like expound upon, like a love for like one, but to a twisted degree. All right, so this was basically there's like some ideas basically we've had for like expanding on like a book 6 or like something basically for like Fay Beyond. I probably wouldn't actually like follow like with like Fay anymore though at this point because I've already basically written like full novel based at this point for the most part. But these like be like ideas I might want to like shove into like other ideas I might have. One idea I basically have is like maybe do some poetry for like the Krog, for example, so like show them like felling like road bases and stuff like that. But whatever. Well, that's basically it for like the read-through. I might go through a little bit more, but this is really like the official end for it, so take care.